Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to call this meeting to order. I would like to thank you all for coming to our special meeting about the tax incentives workshop for the historic properties. I am now going to turn this over to Mr. McLaughlin.
Okay.
Hello, I'd like to welcome everybody here. When a lot of times when we have these energetic conversations about historic preservation, things of that nature, I feel that as a municipality we need to serve as leaders and help guide certain initiatives. So what we did is we wanted to bring Mr. Adolphson here this evening to give us a workshop on the historical tax credit process. This is not something that would be administered through the town of Hope Mills, but it's something that we could help facilitate because we are very interested in revitalizing our historic district. So with that said, I'll turn it over to Mr. Jeff Adolphson with the State Historic Preservation Office. Thanks.
Madam Mayor Pro Tem,
Yes, sir.
we haven't had a prayer or the pledge yet.
Oh, I'm sorry. Mr. Grilly Mitchell, do you mind doing the invocation for us tonight, sir?
Yes, I will.
If you all will please stand and we'll follow that with a pledge of allegiance.
All right. Let us bow our head. Dear Heavenly Father, we're so grateful and thankful for allowing us to be here today. We ask you to allow us to discuss this meeting in a very knowledgeable, professional, and understanding manner that will be beneficial to everyone. These blessings we ask for you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. I
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you.
Madam Mayor Pro Tem, I'd also like to have us to remember the mayor's family in our prayers.
Yes, and the mayor would like for you all to know she's with a family member having a medical procedure done. Everything is okay, but she could not be here tonight. So and thank you, Mr. I don't want to say Adolphson, for coming to present this information to us tonight. If you will proceed, sir.
All right.
Sorry.
Can you all hear me if I don't use the microphone? I think I've been told it.
Being
No?
recorded.
We kind of need
Oh.
you to
Oh.
use the microphone so that the recording will pick you up.
Okay. I'll try to conform.
I'm trying to convince our finance director we need a wireless mic here at the
All right. Well, good evening. I'm Jeff Adolphson. I'm a senior restoration specialist with the North Carolina State Historic Preservation Office. I appreciate the invitation to speak to you tonight. I'm going to talk to you about a couple things. There are economic incentives for the rehabilitation of historic buildings. There are federal programs, state piggyback, and then there's a state homeowners tax credit too. So I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about the Secretary of the Interior Standards for Rehabilitation, which are the guidelines that we use when we're reviewing the work. So I'm just going to jump right in and start with the tax credits. Okay. Well, I can't do that then.
You can turn the laptop.
Okay. Yeah, if you don't mind. All right, that's going to be kind of a pain. All right, so there are three tax credits. There's a federal income producing tax credit that's been around since 1976. If you qualify for that, there's a state piggyback tax credit, and then there's a separate homeowners state tax credit. So y'all don't have to take notes unless you want to, but a lot of this it's going to be available to you. So first of all, tax credit's a whole lot better than a tax deduction. A lot of people don't know the difference. So tax credit comes off the bottom line, and it's all legal. So if you owe Uncle Sam $10,000 and you've got $10,000 of state or federal tax credits, you don't have to pay your taxes in that year. It's a really good economic incentive. A deduction lowers the income to which is subject to taxation. A credit comes right off the bottom. So I'll start with the federal income. So again, it began in 1976. The latest changes were adopted at the end of 2017. The credit is 20% of what's called your qualified rehabilitation expenditures, and I'll explain that in a little bit. The credit is available to owners and long-term lessees. So for my edification, who owns historic property in the historic district, if you know about it? Okay. Is anybody a long-term or a lessee leases? Okay. So if you have a long-term lease, you can utilize it. If you're an owner of a historic property, you can utilize the tax credits. To qualify, the property must be a certified historic structure. I will explain what that is. The project must be income producing and the building must be a depreciable property. Qualified rehabilitation expenditures must exceed the adjusted basis. The adjusted basis, your accountant's going to know what that is from year to year. It's the purchase price minus the land value minus depreciation plus capital improvements through the years. Or you have to spend $5,000 or the adjusted basis, whichever is greater. And I've never seen a $5,000 project in my 29 years working for the state. I've seen two $6,000 ones, but not there. And then all the work has to meet the Secretary of the Interior Standards for Rehabilitation, which is the second PowerPoint that I'll show you. So definitions: a certified historic building is a building that's listed individually in the National Register of Historic Places. Yesterday, before I came here, I was in Rockingham and looked at the post office. That post office is listed individually. There is not a commercial district in Rockingham, but the post office has been listed for 30-something years already. That's a certified historic property. Or a building in a historic district that makes application through our office in the National Park Service to get it certified. So basically, and generally speaking, a building that contributes to the historic district. So again, your qualified rehabilitations or the minimum expenditure of $5,000, whichever is greater. They include eligible hard cost and soft cost to the buildings. It does not include the cost of acquisition. If you're expanding the volume of the building, if you're going to put a dormer in a house, that is not an eligible expense. It does not include landscaping or furnishings. But basically, everything on or in that building, there are a few exceptions. But plumbing, mechanical, electrical, painting, structural work, interior finishes, bathroom, kitchens, all that, eligible expenses. And then the Secretary of the Interior Standards, 10 pretty broad-based statements meant to guide work to historic buildings. They fit nicely on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. Then if you're really a glutton for punishment, you can read the guidelines that accompany that, and that's about 120 pages and written in a recommended and not recommended format for different features for the building. So right here in Hope Mills, there's your historic district. I know there's been a lot of changes to it, but you do have a historic rehabilitation tax credit project. It's an old one, but it was done in 1984, and investment of $70,000 or approximately $175,000 when adjusted for inflation. So while I would say it's not a huge amount, every little bit helps, and I will say it's just another economic tool. And I guess when I started, I probably should have talked a little more about the projects on the cover sheet. All those were from Fayetteville, also in Cumberland County. And Cumberland County has had Fayetteville has had a large number of projects. There's like 120 or 40 properties in the historic district, and we've had like 22 projects or something like that. It's like about 15% of the property owners have utilized the tax credit, so it's a really good economic incentive. So just to show you some examples of past projects, we get a lot of single-family houses. Again, they're rental properties. They're not people's personal residences, but you're leasing them to somebody. And it goes from really simple properties like this one up on the top in Wilmington, Glencoe Mill Village in Alamance County, and then really fine houses like Red Hill Plantation. All of these are examples. More residential project, the Edenton Cotton Mill, which were individual condos. They were the homeowners' tax credits. Second floor residences, which have been coming back for several decades, and many local codes had written them out where you couldn't do it, but now most places have got them where you are allowed to do it. The Austin building in Smithfield in the lower left, largest department store between Raleigh and the ocean when it was built in the 20s or 30s, and that's been elderly housing since the early 1990s when they did a tax credit project, and then just last year they did their second tax credit project on it. when it needed more work on there. And then the Coon School in Wilson, which is a really cool school, I got to say, that was elderly housing, and it had like a huge gymnasium and auditorium. Commercial properties, I'm not sure why that does it. Lots of befores and afters, and you can see what just a little bit of work, like the Louder building up on top that somebody had bricked in or blocked in the windows, just opening them up and doing more sympathetic storefronts where all three bays have the same storefront as they historically would have, and what it does for the streetscape and new awnings and how much it helps rejuvenate it and reconnect the pedestrian with the streetscape. And then the Bear Munson building in the lower left, which is a really nice project, and then the Blunt Harvey building before and after in Greenville, and a lot of restoration. They had modernized this building with those concrete panels on the second floor on up, and they had chipped away a lot of the detail that it protruded, and they put a lot of that back. So a lot of that was restoration work too. And then industrial buildings. The Imperial Tobacco Company of Great Britain and Northern Ireland and Rocky Mount was a huge project. It was $22 or $24 million about 10 years ago, and then they did the Braswell Library beside it, which was like another $6 million. It was a huge infusion of capital into the downtown, and for a project that many people just couldn't see the beauty of. Now, somebody who's loved industrial architecture for most of my life, I think it's a fabulous project. And when you look at the gantry, and this is the main entry in the upper left, you walk underneath the coal gantry when you're walking in the front doors, it's got that cool factor. And then ancillary buildings. If you have a property with multiple buildings on it, like a mill, and you want to do the tax credits, we will certify all the buildings on that property that are historic or thus eligible to receive the tax credits, and those that are not considered historic. And the same goes for the homeowner tax credit. So these are both homeowner tax credit projects. There's a garage behind the Eisenhower house in Sanford, so somebody worked on their house and they got a tax credit for fixing up the garage too. And then this barn, which I think is actually an income producing. So that was a working farm, and somebody had a historic barn, and they did tax credits on the whole, the house and everything else, as well as the barn. So with the federal income producing tax credit, you can do a phased or a non-phased project. On a non-phased project, you have 24 months to spend the adjusted basis. Again, the adjusted basis is the value of the building at a given point in time. On a phased project, you have 60 months to spend that adjusted basis. And the advantage of doing that is if you have a lot of work to do, you can do it in different phases. You have to have a set of architectural drawings that tells what each of those phases are, and you have to list those phases in the application itself. The plans have to be completed before rehabilitation work begins, and reasonably expected that all phases are going to be complete. I looked at 4 buildings yesterday, and I looked at 3 this morning, and I think that like 2 or 3 of them are looking at phase projects. And frequently what somebody will do, like the one I was just looking at in Fayetteville, has a lot of roof leaks. So they're going to put the roof, fix the roof up. They're going to work on the shell of the building, do repointing. They're going to work on the windows, and then they're going to do like plumbing, all the stub ups they got to do, and get the floor ready. Basically a shell where a tenant can come in and say, I want you to do this and this and this. And then we'll look at the tenant upfit drawing. So that'll be the second phase of work for that project. The credit with the federal, the credit has to be taken over a 5-year period. That you used to be able to write it off in 1 year. That was one of the changes that occurred in 2017. The credit has to be taken for the year the project is placed in service. So if I finish my work in July of this year, or on January 1st, or on December 31st, I'm required to start taking the credit that year, which is usually makes kind of sense. You're doing a tax credit project, you want to get your money as early as possible. The credit can be carried back 1 year and forward 20 years. The taxpayer can undertake a historic rehabilitation tax credit as often as they like that project I showed you in Smithfield where they came back about 25 years later and did a second project. But you're not going to do them like every few years because you're spending that adjusted basis, which is the value of the building. If you did it twice within a couple of years, your accountant's probably going to think you're a loony because you're putting way too much money. If you had to sell that building, you would have way too much invested in it. And the tax credit can be transferred, and you do see this every once in a while. So if I'm working on the building and something goes wrong or whatever, and I haven't placed it in service yet and I need the money back, I could sell that to somebody else who can carry the project forward, and then that credit can transfer to the new property owner. There is a recapture though, so that project has to be income producing for 5 years after it's placed in service. If you wait 2 or 3 years, if you wait 2 years and then you sell the project, you have to pay 60% of it back to uncle if you've taken your full tax credit already, plus interest too. So you need to watch that. So this is a federal program, so this is administered by the National Park Service, the same people who have like Yosemite and Cape Hatteras and all, but there's 2 different camps. You got the flora and fauna and the park people over here, and then you got historic resource people over here. So it's the historic resource people that we deal with. They administer it at a federal level in conjunction with all the state historic preservation offices. And every state and territory has a state historic preservation office. That's my employer. State Historic Preservation Office administers the program at the state level, but final authority rests with the National Park Service. The IRS and the Department of Revenue administer the tax and finance side of the income producing programs. People ask us tax questions all the time. As we've been told by the IRS, I don't do windows, you don't do taxes. So we can answer real general stuff, but we always tell people if you have really detailed questions, you got to go to your tax accountant or your tax attorney. And then, yeah, there it is on the bottom. Being a government employee, there's my disqualification statement that you get technical assistance for that. So there's the federal program. If you qualify for that, there's the state piggyback tax credit. That was just signed in. This has always had a 4-year sunset since it was incorporated in 1998 as a piggyback. It kept getting reauthorized every few years, and then in 2015 they went away, and there was a big public outcry. They had over 2,000 articles statewide talking about the economic incentives and how they help their community, and there was a lot of pressure from a lot of different groups that you don't usually see together. American Society of Landscape Architects, American Institute of Architects, State Chamber of Commerce, Association of the county organizations and the municipality, League of Municipalities, and all these other groups got together and they got the tax credits reauthorized. Preservation North Carolina was involved, and they came back, and then they were sunsetting at the end of last year. So this is one of the last few bills that got signed. We still don't have a budget, but we do have the tax credits that are reauthorized for the upcoming year as of November 1st of last year. So the sunset is now extended through January 1st of 2024 for both the income and the homeowner tax credit. So the state tax credit, this did change when the tax credits went away. Right now what you have is a 15% tax credit of up to $10 million. That's $1.5 million. After 10 million, between 10 million and 20 million, that credit drops to 10%, which is another $1 million. You can spend over $20 million, but you do not get a state tax credit on that portion. But again, you will on the federal. You get a couple of development bonuses. If you're in a Tier 1 or a Tier 2 county, Cumberland County is a Tier 1 county, you get a 5% bump up to the $20 million, which is another $1 million. There's also a targeted investment bonus of 5% up to $20 million, again another $1 million, for a manufacturing or agricultural building or a public or private utility, if the building is certified as historic and the building was 65% vacant 2 years preceding the date of the eligibility certification. So your state tax credit could be anywhere from 15 to 25% on top of your federal 20%. So you can get 35 to 45% back for fixing up your historic building. Really nice incentive. There are the county tier designations for each, and Department of Commerce publishes every year. So the maximum state tax credit is $4.5 million on a project of $20 million in a tier 1 or tier 2 county. The state credit has to, as with the federal, be taken the year that the project is placed in service. State credit may be taken in 1 year. That's a change. The state tax credit used to have to take over a 5-year period and then another 5-year period. They changed it to make it more palatable to developers the same year that the federal government changed it going the other direction from 1 to 5 years. And with like the federal credit, you can transfer the state tax credit before it's placed in service too. And again, you have the recapture. So if that project is only in service for 4 years, you may owe 20% of it back if you sell it before that. So in summary, for those two programs, 20% federal tax credit, 15 to 20% state piggyback tax credit, up to $20 million for a combined 35 to 45%. 40 to 45% in a tier 1 and a tier 2 county, 35 to 40% in a tier 3 county potential. So just running real general numbers, $100,000, you have a $20,000 federal tax credit and anywhere from $15,000 to $25,000 of state piggyback tax credits for a total of $35,000 to $45,000. Got a mind of its own. So you could net out spending $55,000 to $65,000 for every $100,000. Now I'll go on to the homeowner's tax credit, unless it wants to do it by itself. Nope. All right. So these are for your personal residences, okay? Primarily houses, multifamily. Again, condominiums. I showed you the project in the Edenton Cotton Mill. Mount Airy did a mill too, where they did individual tax credits or tax credits for the individual condo owners, and then again for your ancillary buildings, garages or whatever you have out in your property. That credit used to be 30%, and it came back as a 15% credit. The old credit was 30% unlimited. You could spend $1 million on your house and get $300,000 back. State legislature said, too much. We're going to go 15% tax credit and cap it at $150,000, which is $22,500 as a tax credit. It's pretty nice still. Minimum threshold is a $10,000 of qualified rehabilitation expenditures, and they have to be incurred within a 24-month period. State tax credit has to be taken the year the project is placed in service, and the credit can be taken in 1 year. It can be carried forward an additional 9 years. So you can take it in 1 year if it works out that way, or up to 10 years, a total of 10 years. Taxpayer is allowed to claim tax credits for rehabilitation every 5 years. So remember, you got a sunset of 4 years, but the credit itself is only 5 years. So hopefully the credits will get, in 2023, will get authorized for another 4 years, but you can only do it every 5 years. And as with the other two tax credits, you can transfer this credit. And you'll see sometimes house flippers, or for whatever reason, somebody's going to go in and fix up a house, and they can transfer the credit to the new buyer as long as they don't place it in service. So you can transfer the credit to someone who's going to buy it, and then you can get full asking price for your house, and whoever buys it has a nice little tax credit to go for a while. So the applications for these, again, federal, state, there's a part 1 for the federal, or the attachment 1 for the state. That's where we certify the property as being historic. Part 2 for the federal income producing, or Part A for the state, is a description of existing conditions in the proposed work. You've got photographs and then boxes where you talk about the roof, talk about the windows, talk about the doors, talk about the siding, the porch, trim work, the site on the interior, plumbing, mechanical, electrical, floor, ceiling, wall finishes, millwork, interior doors. You're talking about all that. If you're not doing any work to it, you just say not applicable. But if you plan to do work, you just need to tell us what you're doing to it. And then part 3 is the after, where we certify that the work does meet the Secretary of the Interior standards, and that's called a certified historic rehabilitation. When you got that part 3, you can file it with your federal taxes, and that part B, you can file it with your state taxes. Not to bore everybody, but there's the actual application. And I've always been amazed, as popular as these tax credits are, that we don't have more projects. So, not to be condescending or anything, but it's really kind of simple. The first page, not too bad. It's just got owner information, name, address, building name, address, how much of an estimate you think you're going to spend. This is before, doesn't have to be right, it's an estimate. No estimate's ever been on the dollar. I know I spent 2.5 times on my house what I thought I was going to do. And then a little bit of other information. And then the part 1, the description of the building, and then a statement of significance, how that building relates to all the other buildings. And it doesn't, this isn't a term paper, just a couple paragraphs at best. And we read layman all the time. It's okay. It'll be okay. You can fill it out. It'll be fine. Part 2, again, same owner information, and there's the boxes. Oops, that's the old form. You didn't see that. I'm sorry. But like these boxes, you'll just go like roof, and you'll explain the existing condition and the proposed work, and then we've got the set of photos that have been submitted with the application. We can say, yeah, that's reasonable, or you may have a condition placed on it. And then the part 3, again, there it is. It's just a 1 page, and anybody who wants the tax credit, if you have partners, everybody's got to sign the back side of that sheet. Everybody's got to put their taxpayer identification name and their address, and then the final estimate as to dollars that were spent, and then the part 3 photographs, so we can see that what you said was going to be done did indeed get done, and that all the terms of the conditions were met that were placed on the project. So just some miscellaneous. So a certified rehabilitation, I did talk about this before, but it's a rehabilitation of a certified structure, again, a building that's listed individually or a building that's certified as contributing to that district. So a certified structure is rehabilitated to the standards, the Secretary of the Interior standards. That's what the Part 3 and the Part B is signing off, that you have a certified rehab. Income producing projects are subject to a joint review by our office and the Park Service. Non-income, the homeowner, are just reviewed by our office. Owner must begin taking the credit the year the project's placed in service. You got the phased and the non-phased projects. Tax credits can be taken before the completion of the entire project on a phased project if you've met that adjustable basis. The people I was meeting with today in Fayetteville, they're easily going to meet. The building had a very poor roof and was basically 4 walls, and half of the second floor was there. There wasn't a whole lot, so I don't think they paid a whole lot for it. So they're going to put a new roof on it and get the shell up and put a new floor in, and it's going to be a shell where somebody can say, I want you to do this and this. So after phase 1, they'll probably have spent their adjusted basis. They can submit the paperwork to us and start claiming their credit, and then when they start doing their tenant upfits, they'll send us an amendment where we review that work. And then we'll close that project out after they do their tenant upfit, and then it'll be done, and they'll be able to finish the rest of their tax credits. So again, tax credits can be taken over can be taken over a 5-year period. You can go back 1 year and forward 20 years. State tax credit can be taken in 1 year and up to 10 years. State tax credit can be carried forward an additional 9 years. And then it's a joint review between the National Park Service and our office. Minimum expenditure requirements, Again, you have to spend a qualified or adjusted basis, purchase price minus land value minus depreciation plus capital improvements. And for the homeowners, it's a minimum expenditure of $10,000. Now, there's no test. All you have to do is, if you want a little cheat sheet, I wrote it up for everybody. It's got everything right there. Certified historic structure. They all have to be a certified structure. The income producing properties have to be depreciable. No for the homeowners. And the rest of it, it'll be available, Chancellor, online or whatever.
To anybody, if you need it, I can email it to you, but I will have both presentations on our website.
Okay. Or people can call me, and the website used to be really easy. It's no longer easy. It's like this long. You'll just have to Google North Carolina State Historic Preservation Office and my name, and then it'll bring you up to the staff directory. So just a little bit about the economics, and I think this is what's really cool about this. You can see, again, federal tax credit started in 1976. The state piggyback tax credit started in 1998. So that first period from 76 to the end of 97, we had 669 projects, total expenditure of $282 million, adjusted for inflation, $616 million. That's okay. That's pretty good. You go to when the state did their piggyback tax credit, where you can get twice under the old program, and now anywhere from a little bit less to maybe a little bit more, and also a 22-year period from 1998 through the end of last year, we had 960 projects, or almost 60% of the total projects in that last half of the time. Total investment is $2.416 billion, which is 90% of the investment of the first half. When you adjust it for inflation, it's over $2.8 billion, or 82% of the total investment, largely because of the state piggyback tax credit, I would say. You can look at the statistical charts from 2010 and 2019 and the number of projects that you've got. And you've got a few large cities. You've got Raleigh and Durham. You've got Fayetteville in there. You've got Asheville and Wilmington. You've got some mid-sized cities, original Main Street cities like Shelby and Washington and New Bern and places like that that have a really good ethic when it comes to historic preservation. And there's a number of projects, just a straight count going up the left side. You can also look at these as projects per capita, and I think this is where towns like Hope Mills and all, because when the legislature said we weren't going to renew the tax credits in 2014, they said, well, 75% of the credits are going to the big cities. How are we helping the small cities? Well, that other 25% is going there. So when you look at this, and you've got the number of projects per 1,000 residents with a minimum of 5 projects in each of these cities, and then the cities on the right, it's a little confusing, sorry. So cities in green are Main Street cities. Cities in red are too large. Populations of over 50,000, they cannot be Main Street cities. So you'll have like Edenton, which is well, this is an old number. At the time, it was 132nd in population. And then it goes, you got Fayetteville at the bottom there and all, but this changes a whole lot in the last few years. Most of the big cities are off. The only big cities in the top 20 are Asheville and Wilmington, and they're 11th and 8th in population. Number 1 is Edenton, still 132nd in population. Marshall, 351st in population. They got 5 tax credit projects, and I don't even think they have 1,000 residents in there, but they're number 2 in the state projects per capita. Little Washington, 85th, is number 3. Weldon, 270th. Now that was one developer doing a bunch of projects, doing 3 of the 5 projects. Beaufort, 159th. Then you get like New Bern and Salisbury, and they're like in the 20s, and they're older, somewhat moderate-sized cities, but you also have like Elkin. And when you look at that list, I don't think anybody there would think that these are the economic engines of the state. When I think of the economic engines of the state, I'm looking at that I-40 corridor going basically from Raleigh all the way down to Gastonia and all those cities within a few miles, Concord and Charlotte, Salisbury, Winston-Salem and Greensboro. Those are the economic engines, but these are not those cities. These are people in the hinterlands who have found that preservation works for them, and it's a really good economic tool. And then you can look at it a different way, and our GIS guy, he did this one. So this is a commercial project investment for amount per every resident. So Elk Park is not a city, it's just a neighborhood, I think, in Asheville. And then Warrenton is like number 2, Marshall again, Hillsborough, Milton, Woodland. Again, these aren't exactly the economic engines. You do have Winston-Salem, which has had a couple of $90 million plus projects for biomedical research facilities and all. And then these are the projects that I didn't talk about. This is the last slide in the tax credit. So there's our web address. So again, it's going to be easier just to Google me and the State Historic Preservation Office. But the Prince Charles Hotel was a tax credit project in the late 80s. It was one of the first Part 3s that I closed out when I started my job in 1990. And they're currently doing a second tax credit project on the Prince Charles. The Bow Street warehouses, they just finished their project a year or 2 ago. The Cameo Theater that Chancellor talked about, that was one of the buildings that we toured when we did the workshop in Fayetteville last August. The Culberth Warehouse, which is where the Chamber of Commerce is. The Capitol Department Store, which was 3 older buildings that in the mid-50s were brought together with a uniform front and given this modern appearance. And it was actually, I can't remember the architect, I think he came from up north, but really nice project. Does anybody have questions about that before I go to the other one? Now I'm going to talk about the Secretary of the Interior Standards for Rehabilitation and the accompanying guidelines for rehabilitating historic properties. And when we review projects, this is what we review. People will say, oh, Jeff wouldn't let me do whatever. Well, I could tell you anything, but these are the guidelines. It doesn't matter what my personal opinion is. We have to apply these guidelines, whether it's a tax credit project, or whether it's an environmental review project, or whether it's a state-owned building. That's what when we review, that's what we apply. So they're the guidelines, and you can get all these if you're so inclined. The guidelines for the 4 different treatments, and then their guidelines for rehabilitating landscapes, and then their sustainability guidelines also. 4 basic treatments for historic properties: preservation, rehabilitation, restoration, reconstruction. I'm not going to read all these definitions. I know you're disappointed. But preservation is basically doing a minimal approach. If I've got a building with a leaky roof, I patch it or I tarp it. If I've got a building that has code violations, I may have to bring it up to code so that I'm no longer in violation. It's just doing a minimal amount of work. It's preserving the most material that you've got in the building. Rehabilitation is by far the most of what we see of what we do. Rehabilitation is where I have a historic building, I'm fixing it up by definition for a modern contemporary use, which may result in some changes, which is going to result in changes, but you keep those key features and finishes that make that building historic. Oh, well, yeah, sorry, I got ahead of myself. So these are just examples of preservation. So the house in Smithfield after Hurricane Floyd 20 years ago, they tarped it to keep any other rains out from the building. The Gethsemane Church in downtown Raleigh got hit by the tornado. It was condemned, and to keep it from getting condemned, they did basically a shell work on the structure. They did a tax credit project. They fixed the roof up. It got shifted, the roof, and then all the concrete block got shifted a little bit. It was that homemade rusticated block. They had to make some more of those block that got cracked in the middle, put it back together. Inside, they just did shell work. Whatever the end use is right now, I don't know, but that was a tax credit project. Rehabilitation, I just explained what it is. And again, the Proctor Hotel in Greenville, before and after photograph. restoration, more museum type quality, or people like our historic sites are going to be doing. That's where you're bringing a building back to a specific point in time, usually for museum work or state historic sites, by removing later additions or alterations to that building or putting things back that were removed. I've only worked on a handful. You got one right up the road, the Oval Ballroom in Fayetteville, which was a William Nichols design building from the 1820s, and a fabulous structure. And it got moved for a dry cleaners in the 1950s and got put on the Heritage Square with the Fayetteville Women's Club property. Bald Head Island Lighthouse, the interior work was all restoration work. Endor Iron Furnace, which has not been restored yet. And then reconstructions, also museum type things where you're going back using archaeology, photographs or whatever, and you're putting the building back for whatever purpose. And here's at Somerset Plantation, which is a state historic site where they reconstructed some of the buildings. So again, preservation, you keep the most, you retain the most historic integrity. Rehabilitation is what we see the most of. It's for a modern, efficient, contemporary use, but you're keeping those features that make that building historic. So the standards are 10 principles developed by the Secretary of the Interior to guide work to historic property. When the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 was passed, they started, back in the old days when there was grant money, they used to dole out money, and they said, all right, we got to put everybody on the same page who gets money to fix up a historic building. So they created these standards and then the accompanying guidelines to make sure everybody was following them. Standards are used by our office, by the National Park Service, architects who are working with owners of historic properties who want to do the tax credits, and property owners should be somewhat familiar with them. And then the accompanying guidelines. We apply both of those. What the guidelines tell you to do, people call us up all the time and say, I got this really awesome building and I want to take the windows out and I want to do this and I want to change this and I want to change that. That's not the starting point. What the guidelines tell you to do is first identify, retain, and preserve historic features and finishes that characterize that building, then to protect and maintain those features, then to repair those features and finishes, and then replace only if too deteriorated to be repaired. That's not your starting format as starting place as it is for so many people. Then they also provide assistance for the design of missing features and then provide direction for additions and alterations. So there's the Secretary of the Interior Standards for Rehabilitation on an 8.5 by 11 sheet. I'm going to go over each one of them, don't worry. So standard 1 states that a property shall be used as it was historically or be given a new use that requires minimal change to its distinctive materials, features, spaces, and spatial relationships. So you've seen some of these houses before. So these have been fixed up, and you can see pretty simple houses in the upper one, and they didn't change any of the forms. They kept all the walls where they were. They just took the plaster out and they put sheetrock up, and that enabled them to insulate the walls, and then they put the electrical and the plumbing in there, and it's a nice little rental house. The one on the lower right is a high quality rental house, a very nice one. I'm sure it's got a nice rent to go with it. And then the Glencoe Mill Village is a property that was donated to the statewide nonprofit Preservation North Carolina about 20-something years ago. And each one of these houses have got protective covenants on them, and if somebody wants to go in and do an addition, if they want to maybe not paint, but if they want to replace something, they got to go through and make sure that they're doing it the right way, because they all have covenants on them. Again, you've seen this one, second floor apartments, condominiums, the mill with residential, Austin Manor, and then the schoolhouse, all with housing in it. And the commercial buildings we've seen, and the industrial building we've seen, and the ancillary buildings. So this standard is kind of hard to mess up, and every once in a while somebody wants to do something in a building that may not be great, but not a whole lot. I think probably one of the biggest mistakes somebody can do is put a use in a building that requires but so many people have access to it. And we've all seen buildings where you got a nice, whether it's going down a residential street and you drive in and it's somebody's office and there's like 20 parking spaces, where they have no front yard, it's turned into a parking lot. So you lose a lot of the features of the site. If you put it in the side or in the back, at least you can preserve somewhat of the green space. So not a great example, but it's kind of hard to mess up standard number one. Rosenwald schools, we've had a couple tax credit projects on those, and this was a 2-classroom. The before is in the upper left where you have the 2 adjoining classrooms, and then there's a they have an industrial room right here. And this building had been previously cut up for a house, and so the owner was looking at doing it again, but doing it in a more sympathetic manner, of which was going to happen, but he didn't do it eventually. But here are the before and after, the proposed drawings in the upper right. So that classroom on the right that had already been cut up and the floor was already marred and they had done some bad things in there, ripping the historic floor, that's where they decided to put the 2 bedrooms and then a bathroom, and then the industrial room is on the bottom, and that's the kitchen. And it was a really good plan. And then the great room the living and dining would have been the big classroom in the upper left, where they had retained the open space and the height of the ceiling and all. It was a really nice plan. Standard 2 states that the historic character of a property shall be retained and preserved. The removal of distinctive materials or the alterations of features, spaces, and spatial relationships that characterize a property shall be avoided. So windows are one of my pet peeves. Your historic windows are probably better than any window you're going to put in there. The materials are far superior when you look at the number of growth rings per inch on an old window. They're easy to maintain and repair. This is my house. I was able to fix them myself with just a few simple hand tools, and the bottom had a lot of rot in the one sash. They're as energy efficient, if not more energy efficient. And I've seen several studies, and one of the window people did this, and I'm convinced he doesn't work for Pella or whoever anymore, but one of their salesmen spoke at a national conference and said that a historic window coupled with a storm window is 15% more energy efficient. And the reason is you're getting that dead airspace when you put that storm window on the outside, which is basically what an insulated glass window is. And then you can look at the life cycle cost analysis too. I've seen windows be replaced every less than 5 years. That's not really efficient. You're just paying somebody hundreds of dollars to put in a new window. And I've seen them last maybe 20 plus years, but they do have a finite life because those 2 panes of glazing have a gasket around them, and they heat up and they cool down daily, seasonally. Over a couple years, they're going to fail eventually. So it's got a finite life. And then I think the other testimony is the lack of maintenance. And again, on my house, it hadn't been painted in probably 20 years before I bought it. And there was a little old lady who had literally died in the house. And her family had it for 4 or 5 years after her death, and they didn't do anything to it. So by the time I got it, it needed a lot of work. But I was able to do it, and only because all that material was still there because of the quality of the wood that was there. And that wood is long since gone. Prince Charles Hotel, it went to court several years ago. The owner, who was out of state, wanted to replace all the windows. And you can see the historic windows on the bottom photograph on the left, and then the replacement windows. And somewhere, it was on like WTVD or whatever, the 11 o'clock news, and the announcer goes, well, those windows don't look alike to me. I couldn't find it. I wanted to put that video clip in there. Look at the metal roofs, and you can see that the historic metal roof is in the upper left, a standing seam metal roof. If you got a historic standing seam metal roof or a flat seam roof, and it's in good shape, I will argue till the cows come home, do not replace it. It is one of the best roofs out there unless you have a problem with it. The replacement roofs don't look like it. You'll have all these different ripples to avoid oil canning and all that they put in there, and then they get all the different color roofs that, and you can literally see them from Google Earth. They stand out. Some of them with the colors like the gray mats, they're a lot better. They don't have as much of an impact. But and then the big ridge caps also. You can get a lot of wind-driven rain coming in under there, and they do have a little piece of metal that's caulked, but I don't want to rely on caulk on my roof. That's holding water out. We also look at the landscape and the relationship of buildings to each other. Long Valley Farm, right up the road from y'all here at one of the newer state parks. Interior spaces and all. This is the Austin Manor Apartments in Smithfield, and this was a historic tax credit project, but it also had low-income housing tax credits. And the developer wanted to floor over this atrium at all 3 levels and make the units bigger or get more units in there. We were like, that is a key feature. You're not going to get your tax credits. So there's the after photograph of them keeping it and all. Schools, we get a lot of schools. This is the Harnett County Training School, another Rosenwald School in Dunn, and this is a campus of several buildings. And this is a typical way of doing, putting a single bedroom apartment in a classroom, because they're about the right size of that classroom. So what you'll do is you'll put the bedroom and the living room and the dining room on that outside wall, like they did in the lower left, and you don't drop the ceiling, but along the corridor, you can drop the ceiling there. In the lower right, you can see the ceiling drops down. That's over the kitchen, that's over the bathroom, that's where they put the air handling unit, that's where they put a lot of the other utilities, and they'll just do sidewall diffusers, and they'll send everything into the bedroom from there. We don't look at later non-historic materials. Every building that's listed in the register, it's an individual building or a historic district, they have what's called a period of significance, from usually the earliest building to whatever. Those materials, typically those materials that are there during the period of significance can be considered historic, are considered historic. My house in the upper left, all that wonderful 4x8 sheet paneling, not historic. Great joy in ripping it all out. But you'll see drop ceilings in houses every once in a while, and not a really nice ceiling finish for a residence. Standard 3, each property shall be recognized as a physical record of its time, place, and use. Changes that create a false sense of historical development, such as adding conjectural features or elements from other properties, shall not be undertaken. So you look at these 2 houses and you think, oh, that's pretty cool. That's like a circa 1900 farmhouse and a nice little federal house. Well, those were sister houses, and the one on the right used to look like the one on the left, and this is in downtown Raleigh. And you can see that it doesn't. Somebody wanted a federal farmhouse, and I would say, well, if you want a federal farmhouse, the interior is going to look like a circa 1900 house too. Why don't you just go buy a federal property? Location, location, location. You can do what you want with your own property, but if you want the tax credits, this is not going to fly, because you're making it look like something else. So they took off the front gable on the second floor. They got rid of the simple 1/1 windows. They got rid of the 3/4 wide porch with the decorative brackets and handrail, and then they made it more austere with a federal building appearance. Adding a bunch of conjectural features, a bunch of trim work and all. Standard 4, changes to a property that have acquired historic significance in their own right shall be retained and preserved. This is Daniel Hurst Plantation in Edgecombe County, and this is a really strange juxtaposition for a house. The original house is on the right. It's an 1818 federal house, real simple, just a story and a half. The front door is where they put the 2-story addition, perpendicular Greek Revival in the 1830s. We wouldn't allow you to do this today, but it's such a crazy property. It's like the only one in the state where they built an addition off the front door. And it's a really peculiar thing. And the developer, when he bought it, it drove him nuts. Thank God it was before I started. It was in the late 80s. And he kept saying he needed to separate those buildings because it was such a stupid thing. Well, it had looked like that for about 160 years before he bought it. So it's historic for that association. Afterwards, he was glad he didn't do it. This is Rock Cliff Farm up in Wake Forest, and I used to serve on the board here. This is B.W. Wells' house, and B.W. Wells moved to North Carolina and taught at NC State. He was a botanist, and he wrote a seminal book about the different plant communities in North Carolina. This is the only property that's associated with him. The house that he lived in when he worked at NC State burned to the ground 20, 30, or 40 years ago. This was his retirement house, and he still worked out of here. So he still did work in his retirement years here, and he would go statewide and give lectures, and he was still doing a lot of different things. And I tell everybody it was a good thing that he was a really good botanist because he made a lousy architect. The main building is on the left, and there's a front porch, this side porch, on the chimney end. He added that, but it had a front porch, and he filled the front porch in for a closet for the master bedroom and a bathroom. It's the front porch, and it's like, ugh. But whatever, he did it. That building is listed in the National Register of Historic Places for its association with B.W. Wells, so B.W. Wells' changes to that property are considered historic. Thus, it's historic. And similarly, in Wilmington, this was a tax credit project several years ago, is a nice Italianate house. And you'll see people make changes to their houses all the time. This was an Italianate house. All the mantles on the first floor were originally Italianate marbled mantles or slate that were painted to look like marble, like the one on the second floor. And then in the early 20th century, they came in and replaced all the first floor mantles with Colonial Revival, and then they put that nice 1x6 tile in just as an update. When the owner got it, they said they wanted to restore it, go back to the first period, and we were like, other mantles are historic. And when we explained it to them, they were like, oh, because they just didn't think they were historic. So when we explained it to them, they're like, oh yeah, it does talk about the evolution of the house. They were okay with it, and they kept it. This is going back to the Harnett County Training School in Dunn, and this period of significance for this property starts in 1922 in the center with that two-story brick classroom building on a raised basement. They put all the way to the right a single-story brick classroom addition in 1927, and then in 1948 the nice gym all the way on the left, and then in the mid-50s they built a modernist cafeteria and a modernist home economic building. All of these buildings are in the period of significance, and they're all historic. So you've got 5 different buildings, 4 different eras of architecture, or 3 different eras. So there's the two-story, the original classroom, taken with the stair additions later, but the front of the building is in the middle. And then the cafeteria, modernist building, and the multi-purpose modernist building, and the 27 on the lower, and then the gym from 1948. And all very different uses, and they did a really nice job on all of them. Standard 5, distinctive materials, features, finishes, and construction techniques are examples of craftsmanship that characterize a property shall be preserved. A lot of things that we look at is all the decorative woodwork on the outside of a house, whether it's siding, whether it's porches, gable ends, all that decorative trim work on porches, box gutters, all that stuff, or box cornices. On the interior, you can have plaster cornices, plaster centerpieces, built-ins, like go with a house in a dining room or a butler's pantry, nice decorative floors, or even the original wide planking floor, millwork, mantles, baseboards, door and window surrounds. And then even real simple properties, Glencoe Mill Village, that one in Alamance County that I showed you before, that streetscape photograph, real simple construction. These were mill houses, but they're all historic, not architecturally designed, but they were functional to house the mill workers and get a little bit of rent out of them after you paid them. Give them with one hand and take out of the other. Wood floors, plaster exterior walls, interior board sheathed walls. Standard 6, deteriorated historic features shall be repaired rather than replaced. Where the severity of deterioration requires replacement of a distinctive feature, the new feature shall match the old in design, color, texture, and where possible, materials. Replacement of missing features shall be substantiated by documentary and physical evidence. This is the Poe House at the top in Fayetteville and Bellamy Mansion in Wilmington, and both have used elastomeric coatings. An elastomeric coating, if you've got a standing seam roof that's got some rusting, it's got some pitting, this is a really good way of fixing that roof and getting another 20, 25 years out of it. And then you can do it again and extend the life again. The Bellamy Mansion was owned by Preservation North Carolina. They took ownership in the early 90s. And they're like every other nonprofit. They don't have two nickels to rub together, and they were even had fewer nickels back then. A new roof was going to be like over $200,000, or they could have applied this as a stopgap measure. And that's what they did, and it's still going strong. And then the Poe House in Fayetteville, they were going to review. I got drawings to review for the new standing seam metal roof, and I was like, that's the historic metal roof on there. Let's just put the elastomeric coating on there. So saved a lot of money and were able to keep the historic metal roof on that building. Slate roof. If you got a slate roof, it's a wonderful roof. Most of those cruddy slates from the southeast Pennsylvania quarries, they're probably gone now. They only had about a 50 or 60 year lifespan. The slate that's up on the roof now is probably like Vermont or Buckingham or Peachtree from Georgia, and a lot denser and a really good roof. Don't let your roofer walk on your slate roof. Siding, you only want to replace a little bit of siding as needed. And this property in Wilmington on the left, in Wilmington, if you've been there, the houses are so close together, there's a historic ordinance that says you can go on your neighbor's roof to do maintenance on your roof. That's how close the roofs are together. And you can see, so if they're that close in 2 stories and you got a lot of water pouring off the roof, you're going to get a lot of splashback. So they replaced the bottom few siding boards here, and then maybe a little too much on the porch, but then where it'll wick back on the porch, those few little short boards there on the outside of where that beam ties back into the house, they replaced that. This was on the right, this was somebody's, they weren't trying to pull the wool over our eyes, obviously. They took all the historic siding off the house and wanted tax credits for it. It's a historic material. That siding, like the windows, is a lot better than anything you're going to get on today. You can see the stuff that they put up. That's what I would call whitewood. It may even be white pine from up in New England. I'm not sure. You put white pine in North Carolina, you're going to be lucky to get 10 years out of it. And you look at all the knots in it. They didn't back prime it. They didn't put copper naphthenate on it or anything to extend the life. I'll bet you if they get 10 years out of that, they'll be lucky. And they didn't get their credits. There's various ways of removing paint and lead paint. You can do heat, you can do scraping, you can do infrared on the lower left. You can do steam them. You can steam them too. And again, going back to the windows, key features in any building is looking at the windows. And here's a window workshop our office helped do in Edenton about 5 or 7 years ago. And if you're going to take your sash out, this is how you do. You just put a piece of plywood in there, 2x4s on the inside and the outside, carriage bolts. Make sure the nuts are on the inside so that the thieves can't get in there and take them off from the outside. And then you got it secured. If you've got the depth, you can put in insulated glass, but as I said before, insulated glass has a finite life, so I kind of question why you might do that. I would prefer to put single glazed windows in a storm window, and then you're still going to get that dead air space that you're looking for. Lead on windows and all, you can scrape down the sides of the window sash, you can put a jam liner in there and then put them back in, and you can scrape the lead off on the jam too. Well, the jam is covered, so you don't have a lead surface abrading and creating lead dust. Here's a storm window. This is the grand opening of the Sanford Buggy Factory a few years ago after the tax credits came back, or when they were trying to bring the tax credits back, and this is the grand reopening and all. And storm windows. If you're going to do window work, we're going to need to see detailed drawings. We're going to need to see drawings of the historic windows and what you propose. And they need to look alike. So we're going to need to see large-scale sections through the head, the jamb, the mutton, the sill. If you've got a transom bar, we're going to need to see all that. You can do epoxy repairs on the base of columns, you'll see. If somebody's got to fix a door, you can do a Dutchman repair. There's various ways, instead of throwing that door or that column out, where you can fix it. Repointing is something that is really mind-numbing, but is really important to do and do right. Fayetteville Market House on the left, and actually when they had taken out the joints, they cut one of the bricks and left the mortar joint beside it. It is mind-numbing work, but it's really something that requires a lot of care when you're doing it. Taking out the old joint and repointing. Then the guidelines also give you care in the restoration of something such as the porch, and they took out the bathroom and the filled-in porch and then restored the porch for this house. That storefront that I showed you before, really nice project in Wilmington about 10 years ago, and somebody had covered up the transom where the sign is in the upper left, and then just a modern glass storefront, and then they had recessed the entry. They lost leasable space to do this. This is what doesn't make sense to me, and put in a new brick wall with some goofy front door, and then they came back, the architects, this is a husband and wife architect team, they did a really nice job and put this new storefront in. Standard 7, chemical or physical treatments, if appropriate, shall be undertaken using the gentlest means possible. Treatments that cause damage to historic materials shall not be used. So if you have a masonry building, you're going to clean it, you're always going to get a condition that says use the gentlest means possible. If you start off ultra aggressive, you can't go back anywhere else, and you may not need to do that, and you may cause damage. So just start off, and it can be simply just washing it with a bristle brush and seeing what happens, or maybe applying some simple cleaner, and then if that doesn't do it, you just step up with what they've got. And almost any company that does this work will do a little sample for you so you can see what it looks like. Sandblasting, thankfully don't get a lot of sandblasting questions. I used to get 30 years ago, I used to get a sandblasting question or two every month, it seemed like. I don't think I've had a sandblasting question for the last year. When you sandblast a brick building, you are physically abrading that hard-fired surface of that brick off, and that nice struck joint which provided some protection to you, you're abrading that off. Historic brick and historic lime-based mortars are absorbent by nature. If you take off the face of them, they're going to be more absorbent. And then they are susceptible to frost damage. You get water in there, and then it freezes, and you'll see frequently sandblasted brick buildings where the face starts to pop off, which has happened here. This is the Smith House at Aversboro Battlefield right up the road, and somebody with good intentions went in there and repointed, but with a really hard mortar, and the mortar is harder than the brick, and so anything that's harder that's next to something that's adjacent that's softer, the softer brick is what lost, and almost every one of those brick faces is spalled off, and now that whole chimney's laying on the ground. You do not want to use to remove paint an open flame. It'll vaporize the lead, and you're going to scorch the wood, as you see in the upper two photographs. You don't want to use caustic chemical strippers, which is in the upper right, or high pressure washer. And when I tell people high pressure, you can go a couple hundred PSI, but I don't even think I do that, because you can still, with a couple hundred PSI and you're going up, you're still shooting water underneath the clapboards, and you can get your interior wall cavity wet. This is actually the office we used to be in the lower left, and the guy from maintenance came out, and the pressure washer was factory set at 3,000 PSI, and he came out with a full load of water, and he came out and started blasting the paint off the side, and we ran out there, told him to stop, and you can see all where he eroded the wood, and then when they painted it on the right, you still see that. It's got a primer coat and 2 finish coats, and it still stands out. We've had a couple tax credit projects that have removed later aluminum siding and restored the underlying wood siding. I think aluminum and vinyl siding get blamed for a lot of evils in the world. I mean, and they can conceal if you have water problems. I think it's overplayed what the extent of it is, but this is a house in Wilson, and nobody knew how bad it was because of the vinyl siding on the outside, and the ceiling, the roof hadn't collapsed, the sills hadn't collapsed or anything, but apparently when they went in there, you could literally pull those like cross members, those structural members out above the door out with your hand, and some of the vertical studs too. You need to look at proper drainage for buildings, even temporary drainage. This is the Heck Andrews house in downtown Raleigh on the left. And when the state owned it, and the state was not a good steward for that property, they put this temporary system. It looks like Hades, but at least it kept the water off the roof and away from the siding and all. And you can see what all that water was doing along the siding, all that organic growth. So, in just simple maintenance, the one on the right is white mold underneath that. That's the Smith house at Aversboro Battlefield. They had a leaky water heater for several years, apparently. When I took that picture, I couldn't breathe for like 2 days afterwards. Standard 8, archaeological resources shall be protected and preserved in place. If such resources must be disturbed, mitigation measures shall be undertaken. Going back to the Smith house at Aversboro, they had a grant project several years ago, those old federal highway enhancement transportation grants, and this is when they were going to restore that house and make it a transportation museum and a visitor center for the battlefield. And so they wanted public restrooms, and they wanted a maintenance building. And anytime you do stuff like that, you cannot build it on top of an archaeological resource. And for our own information, we needed to know where those outbuildings were for interpretation. So this is ground penetrating radar, and you're looking for irregularities in the subsurface. It throws out radar and comes back, and you're not going to find everything. But we were looking for like foundations basically for the kitchen. We had no idea where the kitchen was. We figured it was out back, but we never found it. With GPR. Did find the septic field though. Standards 9 and 10 deal with additions and basically making them sympathetic, and if you remove them in the future you don't damage the historic building, so making sure that they're self-contained and they can be removed in the future. And this is a nice 2-story connector at the Durham Hosiery Mill, and this is an old project. This is like from the late 80s, and it's just a really nice connector between the 2 and the 3-story building. The first floor, some glazing and like drive it so it sort of fades away. It's the same color sort of as the masonry walls that it abuts to, and then the second story metal connector, which nice industrial character. When you could see somebody doing this in the mill, and that project in Rocky Mount that I showed you between the 2 and the 3-story building, they actually did put a 2-story connector there. Additions for houses just go simple. In the upper left, you'll see them telescoping. Historically, sometimes if they're side gables, they can telescope out the side, but they're usually going to be on the gable end. And then property like this on the right with the side gable, you'll historically get a 1 or 2-story L out the back, so just build your addition out the back again. And I would say something that's not all that sympathetic, nice little post-World War II cottage, and they filled in the front porch. And then this is a tax credit project that did not get tax credits, and you can see the original in the upper left. And this kind of fits into the standard number 1, different uses and using the appropriate use. It's the same use. It was a residential before and afterwards, but if you've got like 5 kids or something like that, you need 5,000 square feet or 3,000 square feet, and you buy like a 1,500 square foot house, it may not work. They wanted to do a roof addition or pop up, remove the entire roof and put a 2nd-story addition, and they did. And they didn't get their tax credits. I mean, you're allowed to do what you want with your own house, but if you want your tax credits, because now that's basically a new house is how it would be viewed. If they were to survey this historic district today, that would be a non-contributing building. And then I think everybody here could probably agree that this is not the most sympathetic addition. And this building, fortunately, was put out of its misery about 5 years ago, but it's It was a pretty nice house at one time, 2-story front gable with a nice full width porch, and then somebody came in on the ground floor, and like I said, you don't want to do additions off the front, but they filled in the porch and then they made it deeper and made it out of brick, a different material and perpendicular to it. It's like textbook what you don't want to do. So there are the applications again. And then there's some additional resources. All this is available online, the treatments of historic buildings. There's an illustrated guide for rehabilitating buildings, the guidelines for landscapes, and the guidelines for sustainability. So those are my two PowerPoints. Does anybody have any questions for me? Y'all ready to go out and start spending money then, right?
Mr. Mayor Pro Tem.
No questions?
Yes, sir.
There's a test before you leave.
Jeff, I have a question for you, if I may. Back here behind you.
It's like, boy,
Back here.
the acoustics are weird here. I kept looking here.
Back
I'm sorry.
here. Who does the bookkeeping for all this funding? Is that your office? When I say bookkeeping, who keeps track of?
Well, every time we have a certified rehabilitation, Part 3 or Part B completed, it goes into our database. We have a database for all the different stages, but we keep tabs of all of that. So that's the economic data that I gave you. I can tell you that we had 669 projects at $2.416 billion. So we keep all that. We get that estimate from the final paperwork that the owner sends to us.
Okay. So if these people decide to work on their building, they have to pay out of pocket first?
You're paying out of pocket, it's a tax credit. So we have to certify the project after you're done with it, don't forget. You can't get certified until the work is done. So when that work is done, then it gets certified, so you're paying out of pocket, but you're getting your credit later. So everybody's circumstances are different. For a homeowner, I paid up front just like everybody else. For a commercial project, there are developers who will have an LLC for each of their buildings, and they do nothing but this all day long. This is what they do for a living. Each one of their buildings will be LLC 1, 2, 3, or whatever. So they'll keep track of it all, but they're spending it all up front.
I think it's hard for a lot of people to come up with that much money on the
It is,
front side.
And it's hard where you don't have an appraised value that's going to appraise after you put all that money into it.
I
That's
understand.
another
Yes, sir.
issue.
I agree.
It's another tool. It's not a cure-all, but it's a really good tool. And as I showed you, all those small towns across the state that have utilized it, there's a ton of them. I mean, we've had tax credit projects in 90 of the 100 counties, and we're going to have it in number 91 when Alexander County finishes their mill in Taylorsville within a year.
I think we have a lot of people in this room that have buildings that would probably qualify for a lot of this, from back on Trade Street to some out on Main Street, the old mill that belongs to Mr. Garner back there. We probably have a lot of buildings that will qualify for this, but how many people we have that have a lot of money to put up front
I know.
is
And-
is the thing.
So the one thing I would say, you can do it yourself, or if you don't have the money and it's kind of a noose around your neck, you can look at selling the building. You can sell it through Preservation of North Carolina, the statewide nonprofit. They can come in, put it on their website, they can put it in their magazine that comes out 2 or 3 times a year for sale. And as I told Chancellor before, I've gotten calls from people from California and New Jersey. They're like, look, I just sold my house. I'm looking at buying this building or this commercial building. And it is a lot of people coming in from out, and they've got the cash. They can go in there and put it in there, and then they can reap the benefits after it. And you're no different from a lot of other places. I can look at Fayetteville when I started in 1990. For those of us who remember Fayetteville, Hay Street and Person Street 30 years ago, I'll bet you it had a 70%, if not an 80% vacancy rate. The only thing that were there were wig shops, pawn shops, and bars.
Don't forget the pizza shops.
I don't remember the pizza job. I remember being outnumbered by the homeless people walking on Hay Street. That's not the case now. We've had 20-something rehab projects in the Fayetteville's a district that's not big, because Fayetteville didn't really explode in population until after like World War II, and we had population growing. So it's got a pretty small downtown for the size of Fayetteville, but it's really contained and has a lot of integrity. And we've had 20 or 22 projects or something, not a lot of money invested, but it's probably $30-something million. So it helped bolster that, and what it also did is it showed you need somebody with the vision, so it showed the vision that people believed in the future, and a lot of those were developers as well as people who owned the buildings, and you would not have gotten all that infill housing on Hay Street. There's 2 or 3 projects, and second-story apartments if it were not for those early pioneers.
Well, I thank you for your presentation tonight. I know there's a lot of people out here would like to be interested in some of this, and thank you guys for coming out tonight.
If you have any questions, you feel free to call me.
Madam Mayor Pro Tem,
Yes, sir.
I got 2 questions, but I think one of them was answered earlier. Both of your presentations, Chancellor, will be on the town website.
Yes, I took a suggestion with emails, but we will have both presentations on Uptown website tomorrow and our email.
Okay. Second one's is a quiz question for those who came tonight. How many slides were in the first presentation? 47.
How many in a second?
87. Thanks.
Exodus.
Thank you, Jeff. Excellent presentation.
A perfect 1,000 batting average.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with Edenton and the mill? Edenton's a lot like Hope Mills, except larger. There's a big mill there, with a lot of houses. And
I've been there many times. It's not my region.
And they are nice. They're real nice, and a lot of.
Edenton, again, #1 in the state in tax credit projects per 1,000 residents. Okay, it's like 132nd population or whatever I said it was. And a lot of that is Preservation North Carolina. I told you that the Glencoe mill was donated to Preservation North Carolina. The Edenton cotton mill was donated to Preservation North Carolina in the mid-90s. That entire big old masonry building in the entire mill village. They had several charrettes because they were like, how are we going to preserve this? So a bunch of us participated and came in with different guidelines. If you buy the house, this is what you're subject to. It's like, came up with a bunch of things where if you want to do an addition, it has to go out the back because they're all basically the same form. You can do insulation the following ways, but you can't do these other ways. You can put storm windows on there. You can't pave your driveway. It has to be gravel because it really is kind of character-defining feature. Outbuildings probably have to go back behind the face or the back side of the building. I don't remember all the details. And then the mill was donated. I mean, that was a huge influx. Now, a lot of those houses in Mill Village, and even the condos, which are not primary houses, they're second houses, they're vacation homes. So while it's nice that it's preserved, it hasn't helped. It has helped the tax base, but you also want bodies to go with those houses. They're 365, and you don't have that. It's just like downtown Nashville, like the Grove Arcade. When they did that, they had like 30-something apartments, and there's like 2 or 3 full-time residents. That's it. That thing is like 90% vacant every day of the year because they're second, third, 20th homes or whatever. Any other questions?
I do have a question. So if a property owner was interested, and I noticed that you said that you have to be careful with the changes that you make, will your office work with them one-on-one if they want to reach out to them?
So what we
Do you-
do, I'm glad you asked that because I probably didn't address that one enough. So again, it's a 3-part application. On the income producing, that's when we certify it at the beginning, whether it's a certified historic property. Part 2 and the Part A, the state piggyback for it. Existing conditions and proposed work. That's where if there's a problem, you want to fill in the windows on the porch, on the back porch, like the McKay house in Dunn. And it had a lot of like vertical divisions, mullions, whereas originally you had your column lines like 10, 12 feet on center. We said maybe one. but get your glazing as big as possible, and then where you have like a little chair rail or something like that, then you can put a solid panel below that, but from the back to the bottom side of the beam, that all needs to be glazing, basically. That was a condition of the project. If you don't like your conditions, you can call me up. They're probably not gonna go away, but we can talk through them. And I will say this, most people are very happy with projects when they're done with them. When I did my house, I had 5 conditions on my project that my boss put on my project, and I worked there. So, I mean, a condition's not bad necessarily, it's just covering everybody's bases. It's good for both parties, it covers us, but it's good for the applicant too, because they know what they need to do to get that project as a certified rehabilitation. And we walk through, we'll go through problem projects all the time. I don't like to, but I think there's always a good design solution that almost everything that the owner wants to do. And if you have an architect with good experience or a contractor with good experience in historic preservation, and everybody in our office, we've almost seen it all at this point in time. I think there's a good solution. We're not reinventing the wheel here. Most of this is same problems coming up over and over, and they're really doable solutions. Sometimes people go, well, I don't want to do that. That's their choice. They don't have to do it if they don't want the tax credit. And I guess a big sticking point is people want to take plaster off on like interior spaces, a 2-story, 3-story building where the first floor was commercial and a finished space. You might have a decorative tin ceiling and plastered walls and wood floors, and they go, oh, I want it to look cool, I want to chip all the plaster off. That's a big no-no, because that, where you have exposed brick walls is going to be like on second floors where they have storage historically, or like warehouses. They're secondary spaces. They're not, I mean, if you were in the mercantile business, you want to put your best foot forward. You want people to come in, you have a nice storefront, nice ceiling, wall, floor finishes, and you chisel all that off 100 years later, it's a different building. And I've had several people walk. It's just a breaking point, but I'll tell you what, 35 to 45% of your money back to keep your plaster walls, which is probably one of the better finishes around. I will take plaster over sheetrock or exposed brick any day. I'd do that in a heartbeat for getting my tax credit.
In this area, Fort Bragg keeps cracking it.
Yeah.
One more question. Do you? I'm assuming you have a list of recommended vendors or contractors that specialize in
We've
this
got a
type of work.
consultants list, so it's broken into professionals such as architects, structural engineers, things like that, and then contractors, general contractors, mill workers, people who can work on windows, masons, and then we've got some suppliers in there too. We can tell you where to go for tin ceilings, salvage wood flooring, things along those lines, or new windows, new millwork to replicate the old. But we are not going to say, call this guy. We're going to try and give you, I always try and give people at least 3. Sometimes I give people 6 or 7 people because, you know, they can all be an hour and a half away or 2 hours away. I have no idea what everybody's schedule is.
Any other questions? Thank you again, sir, for your presentation, your informative presentation.
Appreciate y'all inviting me. If anybody wants, I'll be hanging around here for a while. If anybody has one-on-one questions they want to ask.
I'll ask for a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
All those in favor, please raise your right hand.